Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in existentialism. This lesson is going to be one of the final videos that we're going to be doing on the subject of Friedrich Nietzsche. And we're going to be focusing in this video on the concept of free will and predeterminism and all the different things that pertain to Nietzsche's conceptualizations and rather contradictory, in my opinion, conceptualizations of free will and determinism from a Nietzschean perspective. This is our penultimate lesson on the philosophy of Nietzsche. The next lesson is going to talk about the concept of the Übermensch and talk about things relating to man and Superman, of course, which is the sort of Bernard Shaw conceptualization in his play. But for now, like I said, we'll talk about the concept of free will, of determination, and as well as the idea of human choice and action in more detail in this lesson. Now, of course, this is a very important, it's a very interesting conception of philosophy that we speak about when we look at existentialism, because of course existentialism, if we're going to use the language and the determination of Viktor Frankl, the famous Holocaust survivor, it can relate to this idea of man's search for meaning. The idea of meaning and finding meaning in life and finding meaning in human decisions and determinations. And so as a result of this, we obviously can conceive of and develop a conceptualization of free will, of human action, and of choice. And this is really where we get into the Nietzschean perspective. So beginning first with the concept of consciousness and naturalism and naturalistic causes, Nietzsche's theories of free will and the idea of determinism resemble, in fact, the works of Schopenhauer. The writings of Schopenhauer. This sort of continental tradition of philosophy takes to generally reject the concept of free will. There is a general, among this sort of time period, as well as this region of the world in which this philosophy is taking place, sort of just ever so slightly prior to Marx. You've sort of got a Hegelian perspective, you've got a Schopenhauer, you've got Nietzsche, of course. We do see something of a rejection, a general rejection of the concept and the existence of free will. For Nietzsche, this can be examined through deeper causes and a more simplistic understanding of consciousness, whereas some philosophers during this time attach a deep amount of meaning behind the concept of consciousness. Nietzsche, on the other hand, rejects this idea, because for Nietzsche, consciousness is not as important as the basic biological and naturalistic approaches to reality. And this is really where we see something of a division and something of a dialectic that you might not have thought existed, because for Nietzsche, there is this idea that, well, I want to really embrace the basic approaches to reality from a biological and naturalistic perspective. And according to Nietzsche, this leads to, at least implicitly, a rejection of, or at least a downplaying of, the basic tenets of consciousness and studies of consciousness. And that's a really interesting conception, because some people would argue that consciousness forms and part of the basic structure of biology and the basic structure of naturalism more generally. But Nietzsche detaches these two concepts from each other, and we end up with this view of consciousness which is not as important in Nietzsche's framework to that of basic biological and naturalistic approaches to reality. Reality can therefore be explained by reference to simple naturalistic characteristics rather than anything deep metaphysical or even by reference to the philosophy of mind. Continuing on then, and taking that into account and taking that into consideration, let's actually start to think about free will and the concept of fate. How does all of this, for example, relate to existentialism? This is not a course on Nietzsche specifically, this is a course on existentialism. Well, as I mentioned, and taking again from the language of Viktor Frankl, since existentialism invites us to examine man's search for meaning, the concept of free choice, the concept of free will, and the concept of fate and determination and determinism are all paramount importance to the existentialist tradition. And so, as a result of which, we have to think about how Nietzsche conceptualizes the understanding of free will and determinism. But for Nietzsche, the answers to these questions are far more basic. All actions are able to be explained by the basic motives and intentions of people who are seeking to perform said actions. So for Nietzsche, there isn't this quite deep philosophical, metaphysical, existential understanding of free will and determinism. There is quite a down-to-earth, there's quite a naturalistic understanding of free will and determinism. Actions can be explained by the basic motives and the basic intentions of people. Very down-to-earth, very naturalistic interpretation. And it provides us philosophers with relatively deflated answers, in fact, to the far deeper questions. In this regard, Nietzsche is quite deflating in the ways in which he conceptualizes these ideas. And so, as a result of which, what does then Nietzsche say about the concept of fate? The idea of something being somebody's fate, that you were always meant to do and perform or be this kind of person. Some people might suggest that it was fate to have their children, or it was fate to become a doctor, and that was always their almost predetermined meaning in life that they would eventually get to. Of course, the concept of fate is very much something of an existentialist idea, because the idea of fate, something being fate, implies that there was some meaning behind it, theoretically. So meeting meeting a loved one is seen to be fate in some circumstances, that it was always meant to happen, and suggesting that something meant to happen implies that there was at least some meaning in it happening. Well, for Nietzsche, this is where things get a little bit more confusing, because in a sense of seeming to be quite contradictory, Nietzsche will defend a traditionalist classical conception of fate on the one hand, but then reject the basic notions of free will in agreement with Schopenhauer, Schopenhauer, on the other hand. And so the classical tradition of fate, as taken from this idea of the ancient Greeks, in fact, is a sort of a Greco-Roman conceptualization, sees it as a fundamental characteristic of life. Noting from the Heraclitean tradition of the concept of fate as character. And so as a result of this, there is this kind of rejection of that. There is the rejection of, there is a defense, should I say, of the traditionalist conception of fate, not a rejection. There is a rejection of the basic notions of free will. So on the one hand, Nietzsche agrees with Schopenhauer about the defense of, or the rejection, should I say, of basic notions of free will, but then he would have agreed with a philosopher like Heraclitus, a pre-Socratic like Heraclitus, the idea that fate is a conceptualization that is fundamental and is a fundamental characteristic of life, is the idea of fate as character. So this is a more positive conceptualization of fate and free will, and this takes more of an existentialist tone in the acceptance of one's fate. For Nietzsche, for example, there is an acceptance of a positive response to what he describes as the Amor Fati, the idea of love of fate, love of one's acceptance, the acceptance of one's fate, the acceptance that fate is something that happens to you, okay? And this fits something similar to some of the basic conceptions of rejecting free will, in a way. Of course, the notion of fate requires the acceptance of one who one is, should I say, and who one ought to become, rather than necessarily a preclusion to taking responsibility for one's actions. So, an acceptance of fate, a belief in the requirements of fate, requires the belief in the acceptance of who one is and who one ought to become. Given that if something is fate, then it theoretically means that it was always meant to happen. And so as a result of which, there is a sort of lack of free will in a way, in the sense of how this is actually conceived. As noted earlier, this is slightly contradictory compared with the Nietzschean concept of free will not existing. However, in some circumstances, it is not contradictory, in a sense that accepting one's fate does require handing over a certain amount of free will to an extent. Understanding that accepting one's fate is accepting that there is some things that were always meant to happen. So theoretically, you could tie that into a basic understanding of free will. From here, we have a bibliography of the various citations and further readings. Of course, there isn't a huge amount of basic literature covering only existentialism. The Cambridge Companion to Existentialism is probably the best place you would want to be, especially the next lesson where we start looking at Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, as well as looking at some of the writings of Martin Heidegger, which we will get to in future lessons' time. These are very much covered in the Cambridge Companion. Other than that, though, Flynn and Snyder's short introduction to existentialism is always very good. I really like the short introduction series from Oxford University Press, because there isn't necessarily the requirement of going into a very big, deep, heavy topic with a lot of things to talk about. It's very, very short. They're often 100 pages, and you could read them in a day in some cases, or even in a week. So they're really good introductions, and so that's a really nice place to start as well. But other than that, the work by Wicks from 2019, Existentialism from Kierkegaard to the Seventh Seal, is also a very good introduction to this as well. But if you want a more advanced reading interpretation, your best bet is probably the Cambridge Companion.